So our next speaker is going to be Danielle Funston. Hello, Danielle. So just to briefly introduce Danielle, she is an accomplished senior technology executive specializing in the areas of strategic and operational planning, solutions delivery. She was a guest on a very fun video podcast that we had last week. I got to know her a little better. A mother of 3 kids and an executive in 2 companies. She is currently the co-founder and president of Sentinel Compliance Group, who happens to be our platinum sponsor today. So thank you, Danielle, for being a sponsor, and thank you for taking the time out of your day to share some thoughts with us.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm really looking forward to it. Appreciate the time. So let's talk a little bit about digital identity. Digital identity is coming, whether we're ready for it or not, and it can actually mean a huge opportunity all around for consumers, for the enterprise. And we want to walk through what it looks like to actually shift the ownership of personal information and identity to consumers where it belongs, where individuals truly own and control that, and how enterprise can actually prepare for this new reality. As it pertains to people, digital identity can mean many things, as we know. It can include anything from digital passports, biometrics, decentralized identity, which we've touched on. I'm not doing it any justice, but there are so many components and certainly so much data that is involved with a digital identity. We want to talk about capturing value today in this world where we're at, and then bridging the gap ultimately to the world where consumers own their own identity that isn't burdensome. We actually need to make sure that everything that we want in the world can actually happen in a way that ensures privacy doesn't get in the way of experiences. It shouldn't be a tax. It should actually be an enabler to personalize experiences and innovation in the enterprise as well. In order to actually bring identity and this new reality to bear, privacy needs to be foundational. It's actually there to enable digital identity, accelerate customer value, and ultimately continue the acceleration that we're seeing right now around innovation. That said, we often forget, and it's easy to forget, that nobody actually interacts with privacy itself. It's not an app, it's not an experience. Privacy is never really the goal unless you're in the academic world around it. But building trust with your customers actually requires it. While privacy is foundational to the structure for which identity is built on, again, it really can't get in the way of that personalized experience. It shouldn't be a barrier. It shouldn't be something that is truly felt in the middle of you and the value that you expect from the entities and the enterprise that you offer your data to. Privacy represents both a philosophical issue, the issue around keeping my information confidential, but then also the operational issue around how do we as a company who's been entrusted with personal data keep that data confidential. The operational issue continues to grow exponentially as well, as organizations are collecting far more data than ever that fuels innovation. There's really great outcomes when that happens, but also think about the velocity and the complexity and the opacity that exists today right now in that scenario. Things like collecting data through IoT interactions that proliferate our lives today, even things like when you're driving your car, which is absolutely an IoT application that we don't even think about. We're giving personal data away all day, and we're expecting companies to treat it well, but the infrastructure in place right now to do that offers a lot of gaps. With new regulation, it's also become the ownership issue. Who owns data, who grants permission for it, and when and how to use it are all at the heart of privacy, and implicit in this is an expectation of owning that identity. Owning your own personal information. Incoming regulations require organizations to manage that requirement. Anne talked a bit about CCPA, and we'll actually look at that in a moment as well. But organizations have to be able to locate with some certainty all the data that belongs to you in order to actually satisfy requests you may have surrounding it. Identity, again, is at the heart of this problem, but we see a future where we can actually help bridge that gap and solve for both the consumer interests and the enterprise. Let's take a look a little bit closer through the lens of CCPA around what this looks like concretely in the real world and how privacy and identity are interwoven. As many of us know, CCPA was passed in June of 2018. There are certainly some changes coming. And it's California's response to data privacy. We're seeing this all over the world. We're grateful for it. It's really a good move in the right direction. That said, we still have a lot of work to do. Not talking about that today. Just as a quick overview, the intentions of the act are to provide California residents with the right to know what personal data is being collected about them, to know whether their information is being sold or disclosed and to who, to say no to the disclosure or sale of their personal data, to access their personal data, to request a business to delete personal information, as well as to not be discriminated against for exercising their privacy rights, among other things. That's a brief overview. Ultimately, though, CCPA establishes the legal basis for holding and using personal information. Consumers gain control of the data lifecycle in this scenario for seemingly the first time in a very concrete way. And it's very exciting, but it's also, again, very complex. Things like consumer data access and deletion requests are complicated for companies right now who are challenged with executing on those with vast amounts of customer data ranging from day-to-day transactions with their customers to personal information provided directly by individuals, and then being able to aggregate and locate it all. That's where we actually solve the problem, and identity is critical for that. Any privacy strategy needs infrastructure and overall data mapping and classification approach to even start to comply with what is a pretty standard right consumers are finally getting to their own information. If we think about another example in the financial world, I think about credit agencies and the power that they have today. Particularly if we think about low-income people who tend to be actually excellent money managers. They're required to be. Good behavior, though, in those cases, often goes undocumented via our current frameworks. They often don't use mainstream banks for fear of hidden fees or going into debt, or often there simply aren't financial institutions accessible to them in their neighborhoods. Most utilities and landlords don't report customers or tenants consistent and good behavior in terms of their financial agreements and commitments because of the overhead and administration that is involved in that. And neither do short-term or payday loan institutions, which is another area where low-income demographic will tend to actually transact. Right now, there's programs focused on helping filter positive financial information for low-income populations up to credit bureaus. And while that's important in enabling low-income demographics, it's still not enough, and it's still within today's broken construct. It still shifts all of that power to the credit agencies. In this scenario, the enterprise who wants validation that an individual can be a responsible borrower also wants to protect themselves. They need to protect from the inherent risk of maintaining detailed records, of endless sensitive data on every customer. And on the other hand, the customer simply wants to securely, privately, and within their own terms, share a validation of a strong financial record so that they can participate in society. On top of all of that, credit bureaus are constantly targeted. Having massive historical record of all of your transactions and financial behaviors, including your personal data, is a huge risk. Having a strong and strategic privacy program embedded into the business is that stepping stone to unify both positions in this scenario. Ultimately, the path forward to enabling digital identity that unlocks financial freedom for anyone requires us not creating a new problem for these disenfranchised individuals from participating in mainstream financial activity. They're ever more vulnerable to privacy threats, and privacy should not be an additional problem or burden, but rather serve to better protect those people who don't have the resources to deal with things like identity theft, pushing them only further to the fringes. So if we think about what it looks like to actually prepare for the future and the complexities that exist, it's easy to see the important value of bringing together identity and privacy as it pertains to how we're empowered to use and own our own personal data, as well as how companies are held accountable to how they use it. The significant technology gaps we need to overcome this and meet this ideal world are what we're trying to address today, at least in a light way. Technology does not solve this very human problem by any means. It's often actually part of the problem. We've lost a lot of discipline in data engineering over the years, to the point that we don't even have a single source of truth as it pertains to identity anymore. Master data management is in a worse state than it's ever been. We've gained a lot of flexibility and velocity in ways, but we've lost the ability to tie together the whole picture. This isn't irreversible, but it's extremely complicated. Even in cases where data and technology have been implemented correctly, modern privacy regulation creates risks in non-comprehensive control of all organizational views of a customer. We clearly need the proper tools to embrace and harness the flexibility that we've gained, the velocity and innovation that we've gained, but also responsibly reestablishing a unified view of the customer and their identity. That truly empowers, again, both the enterprise as it pertains to how they're expected to be held accountable and how they're driving value, as well as the consumer as they continue to get closer to owning their own information and their rights to it. And compliance is absolutely critical and step one and important for the enterprise right now to be focused on. But at Sentinel, we also talk a lot about moving well beyond compliance, on that maturity spectrum around how companies are approaching privacy, both as a strategy and also the right thing to do, and then seeing those eventually, hopefully, as the same thing. The right technology ultimately can enable both understanding the customer as well as privacy first experiences. Technology alone, again, as we've mentioned and we keep talking about, does not address the problem entirely. It never will. We need a way to embed the model into an entire organization and its behaviors. It's not the job of a few people or a team or a set of processes or even values. It actually has to be a part of everything an organization does. Companies are responsible for addressing customer trust through a holistic model, again, spanning well beyond compliance, considering legal and contractual obligations, strategic and ethical approaches, and ultimately all in service of a customer-centric solution. At Sentinel, we call this and encapsulate that concept in our culture wheel. We apply a methodology for measuring and understanding organizations' maturity across all of these key areas in an effort to help push the privacy conversation further away from just compliance, which is an excellent and an important start, to and increasingly towards doing what's right for our consumers. After that strong and holistic privacy posture is established, scaling and operationalizing it throughout the business, as we continue to talk about, is critical to ensure strong privacy outcomes. But this is where technology comes in and is equally as critical. This involves unifying current data with identity. Establishing a culture of privacy requires that shift around how we deliver privacy into the organization through that unified approach of data and identity, and then really delivering to consumers' right to own their own information. Blending together people and tools is how we get there. And at Sentinel, through this process, we've learned the three most important outcomes that can be realized and actually measured in a meaningful way for both companies and consumers are measurability of the effectiveness of the commitments that we've said we will make and that the expectations that consumers have, transparency along the way around what's being done, what's coming, what's changed. We talk a lot about how important education in particular to consumers around the shifts and how their data is being used is important, and for the enterprise, again, to know how to handle that and what to do with it. And ultimately, building trust is that ultimate outcome for everyone. That is where you have that convergence of those aligned incentives that Derek mentioned earlier, where consumers feel they're getting due value and increasing value from the trust that they have then given to companies and entities through their data. At the center, the right technology can help us tie this together. But again, it really takes a holistic approach involving a philosophy and technology that is working in tandem to serve all the necessary parties. So in terms of what this looks like, and in summary, really, unifying both identity and privacy, as well as bridging that gap between enterprise and customer interests, is what's best for everyone. In the enterprise, customer data is growing exponentially. Transforming your approach through technologies is non-negotiable. Your competitors are absolutely there. For consumers, the world where you're expected to provide personal and sensitive data for basic transactions and experiences is over if we want it to be. Ultimately, enterprises that beat consumers to identity, who embrace the right privacy approach and are equipped with the right tool chain, will win. They'll get to help shape the future and also truly innovate and bring to life everything that we've talked about today. And that is Sentinel and Imperity and our approach to privacy.